What's up everyone, it's King Moosh here with JCross to welcome you all back for episode 21 of Class Overview. For those who aren't familiar, the Class Overview series is a collection of informative videos where we're going to be discussing the different classes in Fire Emblem 3 houses.
We'll be going over general information about each class, like their certification requirements, stats, abilities, and their overall strengths and limitations to determine their viability and what units are a good fit for each class. As per usual, these videos will be gameplay focused, so there shouldn't really be any major spoilers, but I advise you anyways to watch at your own discretion, and if you haven't played 3 houses yet, you absolutely should.
This episode will be focused on the Dark Mage class. Just like Mage, it has 4 move, and its movement follows the Mage-like archetype, meaning it ignores penalties from Thicket, Stronghold, and Sand tiles, in exchange for an increased penalty on Water tiles. Dark Mage has 1 class ability, Miasma, which as the name suggests, grants access to the Dark Magic offensive spell Miasma if you don't already have it, and doubles your cast of Miasma if you do already have it. In order to certify for Dark Mage, you will need a C rank in Reason, which is not difficult to obtain, and is shared with Mage. However, unlike Mage, Dark Mage has 2 other strict requirements. Rather than requiring an intermediate seal, Dark Mage requires a Dark Seal, which can only be obtained by defeating the Death Knight in combat or stealing it from him using the Thief Mastery ability. Though that would require a very speedy unit, especially on higher difficulties, because he is very high level in every encounter. Defeating the Death Knight isn't too difficult if you're prepared for it with appropriate combat arts, weapons, or spells, but Dark Seals are still a somewhat limited resource. Your best chance to pick one up during the intermediate stage is during Chapter 4, 6, or 8, but there are a lot of Death Knight encounters throughout the game if you want to pick up the certification later for whatever reason. On that note, another Dark Seal as well as the Dark Mage certification itself are both required to certify for Dark Bishop later during the advanced stage, so that's something to keep in mind. Additionally, Dark Mage has another requirement which is unfortunately very brutal. It's gender locked, and to make it worse, it's gender locked to only male units. The selection of male units that are actually worth using as magic units in 3 houses is rather limited to say the least. Dark Mage shares the same skill level bonuses as Mage, that being a +2 to Reason and +1 to Faith. Male magic units are a lot more limited in their magic promotion options, but the Reason boost is still helpful to reach Dark Bishop, Warlock, Dark Knight, or Mortal Savant, and Faith is still nice to fill out some more of their spell list even if they don't get access to Grummery. These are the main skill ranks all magic units want to invest in, so there's not much to complain about here.
Dark Mage's stats are almost identical to Mage's, with a few minor distinctions we mentioned in the last episode. The base stats are exactly the same, both having a decent base 10 magic 5 res, and having obviously bad physical stats at 4 strength and 3 defense. As for growth rates, they're almost the exact same as Mage's, with the exception being a +5 modifier to Charm that Dark Mage does not have. The standout is still the +10 magic growth that can help pick up an extra magic stat or so during the intermediate stage. The only notable difference between the two, and the reason why Dark Mage stats edge out Mage's slightly, is that instead of a +2 to res, it is a +2 to magic. This makes Dark Mage slightly more threatening offensively, as both classes have no other boosts aside from a +1 to dex with both share and is pretty negligible anyways. Overall, the stats of Dark Mage are pretty solid, and it probably has the best intermediate magic class stat distribution.
Upon mastering Dark Mage, you will gain the infamous Poison Strike as an equipable ability of your own. As you are probably aware of already if you play on Maddening, Poison Strike activates after the unit that has it initiates combat, and that instance of combat ends with both units still alive. The enemy will then take damage after combat has ended equal to 20% of their HP, though Poison Strike can never kill an enemy, it will only drop their HP down to 1 at the absolute lowest. To clarify, you will not be able to activate Poison Strike during the enemy phase, and you will also have to actually hit your attack, it won't activate if you miss. However, Poison Strike can be used with any weapon or damaging spell, as well as combat arts, and through testing I've confirmed that it also works with offensive gambits and siege weapons like ballistas. So to summarize, Poison Strike pretty much always applies extra damage as long as you're in player phase. You hit your attack, and the enemy isn't already at 1 HP. Since Dark Mage is a niche class, I would bet a lot of people only recognize this ability from enemies and don't know it's something you can actually obtain yourself. While your own Poison Strike is unlikely to be as impactful as enemy archers are against you, it can still be a decently useful form of chip damage, and it helps that you can carry it over to classes with more range like Sniper or Bow Knight, which can be really nice for chipping from a safe distance. That being said, Dark Mage is a weird class to put this mastery on. It doesn't have a lot of synergy with the class itself or its promotion options.
Dark Mage comes up slightly short in strengths, but it does have a few redeeming qualities. As I mentioned earlier, Dark Mage's stats are actually decent and the best of the magic classes at this point in the game, at least offensively. Generally speaking, the +2 to magic is more impactful than a +2 to res, since only a few units can function as res tanks, especially at this point in the game. Additionally, Miasma as a class ability is also decent, since gaining access to another spell or gaining more casts of it is definitely useful at this point in the game, where casts are more limited. Unfortunately, it's not as consistent as Fire, which Josh will talk about shortly, but it isn't terrible. Also, while Poison Strike is only situationally useful, the times it does shine would be against boss enemies or just any enemy with high HP, since it does % damage. If you can't one-round one of these targets, Poison Strike is not a bad way to chip away at them, assuming you aren't at risk of a hefty counterattack.
Unfortunately, Dark Mage has a lot more weaknesses than it has strengths. Aside from the slightly higher magic stat boost we mentioned, which really doesn't make a big difference anyways, it's outclassed in pretty much every area by Mage. They are very similar classes, but Mage's mastery ability Fiendish Blow is significantly better than Poison Strike. Poison Strike isn't the worst mastery ever, but compared to Fiendish Blow, which is probably the most essential ability for magic units in the game, it completely falls flat, and it makes taking the time to master Dark Mage just feel like a waste of time when he should be prioritizing Mage instead. Extra damage during combat is always more useful than extra damage after combat ends. Poison Strike will never allow you to one-round an enemy, and in most cases the extra damage won't make any difference on your ability to kill the enemy with a second unit's attack. As for combat performance, the main difference between them is their class abilities, and Fire is just a much more useful spell to grant than Miasma. This is because it is more accurate and lightweight, which makes it reliable and spammable. Miasma is a bit stronger, but it's not like these basic level spells are meant to be strong anyways. That's what we have stronger spells for. Since it is worse than Mage in terms of both mastery and performance, this already leaves it as a situational option at best that some magic units might consider using between mastering Mage and reaching level 20. However, the arguably biggest weakness of this class is the fact that it's male gender locked, which makes an already niche class even more niche, limiting it to the pool of only male magic units. There are frankly not a lot of male units that are actually worth using magic on in 3 houses. It's really only Hubert, Linhardt, Hanneman, and maybe Lorenz, and none of them even particularly synergize well with Dark Mage. That's not to say it would even be optimal in any of the female units, but it would be nice to at least have the option. Like maybe Constance could pick up Poison Strike and apply it from very long range with bolting. Dark Mage also shares the same main weakness as the other magic intermediate classes, which is the limited movement and only 4 move without anything to really make up for it. I'm not going to trash Dark Mage too hard for this, since both its competitors have the same problem, but since Dark Mage doesn't have a lot going for it already, it's harder to ignore.
With that all being said, we've decided on a 1.5 out of 10 for Dark Mage. The class isn't completely irredeemable, but the major weaknesses present hold it back a lot, and in conjunction with Mage being as good as it is, it makes this class hard to justify using. 3 areas we talk about the most in these episodes are stats, mastery, and any class abilities present. Out of those 3, Dark Mage is barely better in one of those categories, while notably worse in the other 2, especially in regards to the mastery. Speaking of, Poison Strike is at least pretty solid compared to something like Unarmed Combat, which is pretty much just completely useless. The decent stats alongside that is part of the reason why this class isn't just a straight 1 out of 10. It's definitely not the worst out of some pretty horrible classes we discussed in the intermediate stage, but it leaves a lot to be desired. As for unit recommendations, this is where another one of the most crucial weaknesses butchers this class, and that's the fact that it's gender locked to male units. A lot of the strong spellcasters in this game are female, which makes it harder than it already is to provide solid recommendations. Nonetheless, Hubert is at least a good candidate for certifying into Dark Mage, as Dark Bishop has a case for being one of his best advanced classes. Dark Bishop most certainly has competition, but it's unlikely that you'll be running low on Dark Seals if you knock the Death Knight around a few times, so in my opinion it's worth it. Hubert wouldn't want to spend any real time in this class though, as he gains a lot from being in Mage since he already has Miasma and is a unit you most likely want Fiendish Blow on. The unit that is probably the least hurt by actually using the class is Lorenz, mainly because he already has Fire at his disposal, assuming he's at D reason.
Dark Mage is going to be joining the unlucky few in F tier. I don't think it's as bad of a class as Brawler or Lord. The extra Miasma uses and the innate magic +2 are probably better than whatever those classes are supposed to offer. If you just ignore the fact that Mage exists, it might be a somewhat decent class. It's just so outclassed by Mage that there's basically no reason anyone should ever use it. A few weeks ago, I did a poll on which magic intermediate class you guys think is the best. I was honestly a little surprised that Dark Mage got over 20% of the vote. I think that the aesthetic of this class probably influences perception of it. It definitely is a very cool looking class, and it's not like it's so bad that it'll ruin your units if you use it, so I think this is totally understandable. There may also be some benefits of this class that we haven't realized, so let us know in the comments. If you really like Dark Mage, feel free to use it, but when focusing on what it actually offers gameplay-wise compared to Mage, we would have to recommend against using this class on anyone, which is why it goes all the way down here. That's basically all we have to say about the Dark Mage class. If you like the video or have any thoughts of your own, please leave a like and make sure to comment.
I also recommend checking the description if you're not already subscribed to both of our channels.
Stay tuned for episode 22 on JCross's channel, where we're moving on to the next intermediate class, Priest.